Alright, let's talk about something that half of humanity deals with every single month. And yet somehow we know more about how ancient people brushed their teeth than how they handled their periods. Strange, right? You'd think with all the pyramids, all the scrolls, all the, hey, let's carve this into stone for the next 3,000 years energy the ancient world had, someone would have left a detailed guide. But no. Instead, we get vague references, awkward euphemisms, and a whole lot of, we don't talk about that. So today we're doing the digging nobody else wants to do. Grab a snack, maybe not a red one, and let's go back in time to answer the question. How on earth did ancient women manage their periods? Let's start in Egypt, because Egypt somehow has an answer for everything. These people invented eyeliner, beer, and bureaucracy, so surely they had period care figured out too, right? Well, kind of. Ancient Egyptian women are believed to have used softened papyrus, essentially rolled and shaped into something like a tampon. Yes, the same material they wrote the Book of the Dead on. Imagine that supply closet. Sorry, we're out of papyrus, the pharaoh needs a new decree, and Hatshepsut needs, well, you know. There's also some evidence pointing to the use of lint, wool, or cloth as external protection, kind of like early pads. Those sources here get shaky because, shockingly, ancient scribes were not exactly thrilled about writing detailed period logs for future YouTubers. Here's the wild part, though. Egyptian medical texts, like the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, actually discuss menstruation pretty openly, at least by ancient standards. They talk about menstrual irregularities, they attempt diagnoses, they even prescribe treatments involving herbal mixtures and dietary changes. So while modern society is still awkwardly whispering about periods in hushed tones near the pharmacy aisle, the Egyptians were out here writing actual medical papers on it 4,000 years ago. Kind of puts things into perspective, doesn't it? And it wasn't purely clinical either. Some Egyptian texts connect menstrual blood with fertility and life-giving power, treating it as something tied to creation itself rather than something shameful, which is a refreshing take compared to what's coming up next. Now let's hop over to ancient Greece, home of philosophy, democracy, and apparently some truly unhinged menstrual theories. The Greeks, bless their toga-wearing hearts, believed menstrual blood was the body getting rid of excess blood that wasn't being used to nourish a fetus. Basically, if you weren't pregnant, your body was just wasting perfectly good blood, according to them. Very efficient thinking, very wrong thinking, but hey, points for creativity. Aristotle himself weighed in, describing menstrual fluid as essentially unrefined semen, a statement that has aged about as well as unrefrigerated Mediterranean fish. As for actual period management, Greek women are thought to have used wads of soft lint or fabric wrapped around small pieces of wood, essentially early tampon-like devices. Historians point to references from Hippocrates himself. Yes, that Hippocrates, the do-no-harm guy, who wrote about menstrual health as part of general medicine. It wasn't taboo to discuss in medical contexts, but socially? Oh, socially, it was a whole different story. Menstruating women in some Greek city-states were considered ritually impure and were kept away from religious ceremonies and sacred spaces, sometimes even barred from touching sacred objects entirely. So you could write a scroll about periods in the doctor's office, but heaven forbid you show up to a temple on day 2 of your cycle. Let's talk Rome next because Rome never misses a chance to be dramatic. Roman attitudes toward menstruation were a genuinely bizarre mixed bag. On one hand, you have Pliny the Elder, a guy who apparently believed menstrual blood had almost supernatural powers. And not in a good way. He claimed that a menstruating woman could turn wine sour just by touching it, could dull the shine of mirrors, could kill bees, could cause crops to wither, and I promise I'm not making this up, could apparently even make dogs go rabid if they tasted her blood. This man wrote an entire encyclopedia and decided period blood was basically a biological weapon. Somewhere, every woman in ancient Rome is rolling her eyes from beyond the grave. But get this. In the same breath, Pliny also claimed menstrual blood could cure certain ailments, ward off evil spirits, and protect crops from pests if applied correctly, and even claimed it could put out fires and calm storms at sea if you really believe the man. So which is it, Pliny? Miracle cure or agricultural apocalypse? Make up your mind. This contradiction actually tells us something important, though. Ancient people didn't have one single unified belief about periods. It was messy, it was regional, and honestly, it was often just made up on the spot by whichever guy had the loudest opinion and the most scrolls to write it down on. For actual hygiene, Roman women likely used wool, much like the Greeks, sometimes soaked in natural astringents to help with odor and comfort. Public bathhouses, something Romans were obsessed with, would have provided some level of access to washing and cleaning cloths, though, again, direct documentation is frustratingly rare. It's almost like ancient historians who were overwhelmingly men didn't think this was worth writing home about. Shocking, I know. Let's shift now to a culture that gets far less attention in these discussions. Ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerians and Babylonians left behind an incredible written record thanks to cuneiform tablets, arguably one of the richest archives of the ancient world. And yet, menstruation barely gets a mention. What we do know suggests women likely used similar materials to their neighbors: cloth, wool, and plant fibers. Some scholars believe certain purification rituals mentioned in religious texts were connected to menstrual cycles, since many ancient Mesopotamian religious practices tied bodily states to spiritual purity or impurity. Women may have been temporarily excluded from temple duties or specific rituals during their cycle, a pattern we're going to see repeat itself over and over as we go through history, almost like there was a universal ancient group chat where everyone agreed periods were spiritually complicated. Now here's where things get genuinely fascinating. Menstrual huts. If you've never heard of this practice, buckle up, because it's one of the most widespread and long-lasting menstrual customs in human history, showing up independently across multiple continents. In numerous indigenous cultures, from parts of Nepal to various indigenous American tribes to certain African communities, menstruating women were sent to live in separate huts or structures for the duration of their period. On the surface, this sounds purely restrictive, and in many cases it absolutely was rooted in ideas of impurity or contamination, sometimes with real consequences for women's health and safety when the huts were poorly built or dangerously isolated. But some anthropologists argue there was a more practical, even communal side to this practice. It offered women a scheduled break from daily labor, a space to rest, and, in some documented cases, an opportunity for social bonding with other menstruating women in the community. Basically, an ancient, if deeply imperfect and often oppressive version of a spa retreat that nobody signed up for voluntarily. Historical and some surviving traditional practices in this space suggest women used moss, soft bark fibers, animal hides, or grasses for absorption, materials chosen based entirely on what was locally available. Different environments, completely different solutions, but the same fundamental problem being solved with whatever nature provided. Some indigenous American accounts describe the use of buffalo hide scraped soft and shaped into absorbent pads, a resourceful solution in regions where the buffalo was already central to nearly every part of daily life, from food to clothing to shelter. Let's talk about ancient China, because the historical record here is honestly one of the more detailed ones we have, thanks to the strength of traditional Chinese medicine documentation. Menstruation was actually a significant topic within traditional Chinese medical theory. It was viewed through the lens of balance, specifically the balance of qi and blood flow through the body. Irregular periods weren't seen as shameful, they were seen as a medical imbalance to be corrected, often through herbal remedies, which practitioners spent considerable time cataloging in texts that have survived for centuries. For actual period care, historical Chinese women are believed to have used belts, holding folded paper or cloth in place, similar to later sanitary belt designs that, surprisingly, persisted well into the 20th century in various forms around the world. Ancient Chinese paper-making technology, some of the most advanced in the ancient world, may have actually been an advantage here, giving women access to absorbent paper products earlier than many other regions could dream of. Sometimes being the most technologically advanced civilization pays off in the most unexpected ways. Let's swing over to ancient Japan for a moment too, because the historical thread here is genuinely interesting. Some records suggest Japanese women used paper, similar to their Chinese neighbors, along with cloth, held in place with a belt-like undergarment. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Interestingly, Japan also developed some of the earliest documented reusable cloth systems, with washable cotton strips that could be cleaned and reused repeatedly, a sustainable approach that modern reusable pad companies are essentially just rediscovering and marketing as revolutionary. Now let's head to ancient India, where menstruation carried an enormous amount of religious and cultural weight, some of which persists strongly even today. Hindu texts contain conflicting messages, some associating menstruation with impurity and requiring seclusion from cooking areas, temples, and even family members during the cycle, while other traditions, interestingly, celebrate menstruation as a symbol of fertility and life force. There's actually a famous temple, the Kamakya Temple in Assam, dedicated to a goddess believed to menstruate annually, where this event is celebrated with a major festival rather than hidden away in shame. It's a striking counterpoint to so much of what we've covered so far, proof that even within a single region, beliefs about periods could swing wildly between reverence and restriction depending on who you asked and which century you were asking in. For hygiene, ancient Indian women are believed to have used cloth, ashes in some rural contexts for absorption, and various plant fibers, with practices varying enormously across such an enormous and diverse subcontinent. Some Ayurvedic texts also mention dietary and herbal recommendations specifically for menstrual health, treating the cycle as something to be supported and balanced through food and rest rather than something to simply endure in silence. Let's not forget the Vikings, because somehow they rarely come up in these conversations despite leaving behind a surprisingly rich archaeological record. Norse sagas don't spend much time on the topic directly, but archaeological evidence suggests Norse women used moss, wool, and linen, materials readily available in Scandinavia, folded and secured with simple belts. Considering how brutally cold Scandinavian winters could get, it's honestly impressive that anyone managed personal hygiene at all without modern heating, and yet daily life, periods included, simply carried on. Now, moving to medieval Europe, and oh boy, this is where things take a turn for the theologically dramatic. The medieval Christian church had opinions, to put it lightly, about menstruation. Drawing partly from older Levitical purity laws found in the Old Testament, which explicitly labeled menstruating women as ritually unclean, medieval European society inherited a lot of that stigma, and then, somehow, made it even more complicated. Some medieval texts described menstrual blood as dangerous, capable of causing disease in men who came into contact with it, or even capable of harming infants. There was a genuinely popular medical belief circulating that a child conceived during menstruation would be born deformed or sickly. Yes, actual physicians believed this. Men with medical degrees, or medieval equivalents, wrote this down as fact and taught it to students. For hygiene, medieval European women largely relied on rags. Hence the origin of the now old-fashioned phrase, "on the rag," which honestly has stuck around far longer than most people probably realize. These rags would be washed and reused, since disposable products obviously didn't exist yet, and fabric wasn't something you casually threw away in a world where clothing was handmade and genuinely expensive. Wealthier women might have access to finer linen, while poorer women made do with whatever scraps were available. Some historical accounts also mention the use of moss for its natural absorbency, a practice that, interestingly, echoes what we saw in entirely unrelated indigenous cultures across the ocean. Moss, it turns out, was basically the universal ancient answer whenever anyone needed something soft and absorbent, from wound care to, well, this. Let's take a quick detour to ancient Africa, a continent with such vast cultural diversity that no single answer applies, but certain patterns do emerge from historical and anthropological records. In many African societies, menstruation was, and in many places still is, tied closely to rites of passage. A girl's first period, called menarche, was often marked with ceremonies signifying her transition into womanhood, sometimes involving seclusion periods, special teachings from older women, or symbolic rituals meant to prepare her for adulthood. For hygiene itself, natural fibers, leaves, and animal skins were commonly used, tailored to whatever environment and resources a specific community had access to, whether that was dense rainforest, arid savanna, or coastal regions. One particularly interesting historical detail comes from various oral traditions describing how certain plants with natural antimicrobial properties were specifically selected for menstrual care, showing a surprisingly sophisticated, generations-deep understanding of what worked and what didn't, passed down entirely through word of mouth rather than written record. Just because something wasn't written down doesn't mean it wasn't knowledge. It just means historians had to work a whole lot harder to piece it together centuries later. And frankly, a lot of that knowledge was probably lost simply because nobody with a stone tablet thought it was important enough to record. Now here's a topic that deserves its own spotlight: ancient contraception and menstrual regulation, because it turns out ancient women weren't just passively managing their cycles. Some were actively trying to control them. This brings us to one of history's great botanical mysteries: silphium. This plant, which grew specifically in a small region near ancient Cyrene in North Africa, was so highly prized in the ancient Mediterranean world for its supposed contraceptive and menstrual regulating properties that it was harvested into complete extinction. Let that sink in for a second. Ancient people used a plant so heavily for reproductive health purposes that the entire species vanished from existence, and we genuinely don't have a modern equivalent to study. Roman writers described it as basically worth its weight in silver. Some coins from Cyrene even had the plant's image stamped right onto them because it was such a massive part of their economy. Imagine a plant so important to menstrual and reproductive health that it ends up on your currency. We don't even put ibuprofen on our money, and that stuff is basically a modern miracle drug for period cramps. Speaking of cramps, did ancient women even have pain relief? Actually, yes, in various forms. Hippocratic texts mention herbal remedies specifically aimed at easing menstrual pain, often involving heated stones or herbal compresses applied to the abdomen, essentially an ancient heating pad situation. Some cultures used specific teas made from herbs believed to have anti-inflammatory or muscle-relaxing properties. Willow bark, which contains compounds chemically similar to modern aspirin, was used across multiple ancient cultures for general pain relief, and it's entirely plausible it found its way into menstrual pain management as well. So next time you're curled up with a heating pad and a cup of tea during a rough cycle, just know women 3,000 years ago were essentially doing the exact same thing, just with slightly less reliable packaging and definitely no streaming service to distract them. Let's circle back to something worth really sitting with: the sheer psychological weight of menstrual taboos throughout history. Across an enormous range of ancient cultures, independently, without any shared communication between, say, Rome and rural Japan, menstruating women were frequently viewed as spiritually dangerous, physically contaminating, or somehow supernaturally charged. This wasn't a one-region phenomenon, it was almost eerily universal. Ancient Jewish law, ancient Hindu texts, various indigenous traditions, Greco-Roman beliefs, all of them, completely independently, arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about menstrual impurity. That's genuinely one of the more fascinating patterns in anthropology. The idea that human societies, separated by oceans and thousands of miles with zero contact, kept landing on remarkably similar taboos surrounding this one specific biological process. Some researchers suggest this points to some kind of deep, almost universal human discomfort with blood and bodily fluids in general, combined with the mysterious, cyclical, seemingly uncontrollable nature of menstruation itself in eras where basic human biology simply wasn't understood. And look, we have to acknowledge a lot of these ancient beliefs directly shaped attitudes that persisted for centuries, honestly some of which linger in subtle ways even today. The idea that periods are something to be hidden, whispered about, or treated with secrecy rather than openness has incredibly deep historical roots. Next time someone awkwardly passes you a tampon under the table like they're smuggling contraband, you can silently thank about 4,000 years of cultural baggage for that instinct. But it wasn't all doom, superstition, and dead bees. There's also strong historical evidence of communities where menstruation was treated with genuine respect, even reverence. Certain indigenous cultures viewed a woman's first period as a sacred and powerful event worth celebrating rather than hiding. Some traditions held that menstruating women possessed heightened spiritual or intuitive abilities during their cycle, and were sometimes even consulted for guidance or healing during that time rather than being pushed away from the community entirely. It's a stark contrast to Pliny confidently insisting your period could apparently ruin his wine collection. It's also worth pointing out that the jump from ancient methods to what we recognize today didn't happen overnight, or even over a few centuries. Well into the 19th century, many women in industrialized nations were still using homemade cloth pads, sometimes pinned into their undergarments, a system not wildly different from what medieval women were doing centuries earlier. Disposable pads didn't become widely commercially available until the early 20th century, and even then, adoption was slow due to cost, social stigma, and, frankly, advertising that could barely say the word menstruation out loud without resorting to euphemisms like sanitary protection or that time of the month. Phrases we're still stuck using today because apparently 4,000 years of awkwardness is a hard habit to break. So, pulling all of this together, how did ancient women actually manage their periods? The honest answer is resourcefully and with whatever their environment gave them. Papyrus in Egypt, wool in Greece and Rome, moss and grasses in various indigenous cultures, cloth belts in China and Japan, rags in medieval Europe, leaves, animal hides, and plant fibers across different regions of Africa, cloth and ash in parts of India, moss and linen in Scandinavia. There was no single universal method because there was no shared global manufacturing supply chain shipping standardized products across continents. Every solution was local, practical, and shaped entirely by available resources, which honestly is kind of a testament to human ingenuity when you think about it. Long before disposable pads, tampons, or menstrual cups existed, women across the entire ancient world found functional, if imperfect, ways to manage a completely universal biological reality, all while frequently being told by the men around them that the whole process was either disgusting, dangerous, or mystically hazardous to nearby wildlife. And maybe that's actually the real takeaway here. Menstruation itself hasn't changed much in thousands of years. The biology is exactly the same as it was for a woman in ancient Sumer. What has changed dramatically is access, materials, medical understanding, and slowly, painfully slowly in some places, the social stigma surrounding it. It took millennia to go from wool wrapped around wood to what's sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now, and honestly, given how casually that convenience gets taken for granted, it's worth appreciating just how much unglamorous, largely undocumented trial and error it took to get here. So next time you're standing in the pharmacy aisle groaning about the price of a box of tampons, just remember, somewhere back in ancient Rome, a woman was out here potentially getting blamed for spoiling an entire vineyard. And somewhere, in ancient Egypt, another woman was casually managing her cycle with the same material used to write actual literature. History is weird. Human bodies are constant. And apparently, no matter the century, someone somewhere is going to have a wildly incorrect opinion about what's happening inside them. If you found this as fascinating as I did digging through it, let me know down in the comments what other overlooked corners of ancient daily life you want uncovered next, because trust me, this was just scratching the surface of how much strange, surprisingly detailed history is hiding in plain sight, just waiting for someone to actually go looking for it.